I'm required to make an analysis as far as nomination fees and party strategies in Uganda's political battlefield today is concerned. I will argue in the following context. I will first of all make a preposition that in Uganda, politics is not just a contest of ideas, it is also a marketplace for survival. That is something you must ponder on. Now, let me begin by arguing that where, the rubber meets the political road, then the question of nomination fees becomes super important. I would like to make the following argument in the context that number one, the price tag for ambition. The question is who pays the play? In every election season, for example, political parties transform into physical gatekeepers. So each aspirant must confront the very fateful question, how much must I pay to appear on the ballot box? This becomes extremely important. But here's the twist. Nomination fees are not just uniform. They vary not just by the level of leadership, but by the ideological DNA of each party. So the NRM, for example, often demands higher fees backed by extensive grassroots network and even incumbency advantage. FDC and UPC or any other party for that purpose tend to peg their fees in terms of modesty, appealing to loyal cadres within limited means. Now, other parties like NUP, for example, the newest kid on the block in terms of this ideological bloc, made a radical decision in terms of trying to democratize by allowing everyone with support and credibility to vie without being bad in terms of these so-called fees. Now, in terms of another aspect that I'd like to cover is the strategic calculus in terms of fundraising versus physical filtering, where the logic behind these fees lies. The question is, for some, these high fees are a wielding tool. They eliminate unsuspicious or even unserious candidates, for example. And then on the other hand, it's about resource mobilization, turning political enthusiasm into a cash flow. Now, but the question is, how do we know and how much are we supposed to charge and at what means? That becomes another important issue. So you ask yourself, did your party, for example, hit its nomination revenue targets, or did you just live through the vibe, through the cycle of hope in terms of, an end? So one must ask this fundamental question. Once that money is in the bag, what happens to it? We could also argue in light of the shadow of the ledger, for example, where does the money go? Yes, let's talk about transparency, for example. In terms of a politically engaged nation, we must ask these disturbing questions in terms of transparency. Not so. So after paying the millions, did the money build the nation campaign, or did it just patch in terms of old debt, for example? That is another super question that you may ask yourself. So how about the aspect in terms of the possible users that could actually, come out of the money that has been collected? We could argue, for example, and say that this money is used for mobilization in terms of what? In terms of fueling transport, for example, for rallies, and even maybe what? Flag bearers, or in terms of what? TV bleeds, for example, or TV spots, or even radio ads, or even digital campaigns, for example, or even in terms of grassroots structures, in terms of parish coordinations, or even LC mobilizations. Not so. We could also argue in terms of debt servicing, or even especially under older parties with legacy liabilities, for example. So those are some of the questions we could ask even as we make this particular discourse. Now, the opacity in terms of this can actually be worsened by weak internal accountability mechanism. In the most political parties, for example, many operate like what? Sacrosanct fortresses. Once the money goes in, it disappears into the so-called political fog. So that's another disturbing point that we have to think about even as we make this dispensation. We could also argue in terms of the state funding and even the so-called have versus the have-nots. In Uganda's political, parties and organization act, for example, it qualifies parties to receive government funding, but let's be clear, this is not equal. It's actually proportional to parliamentary strength. Listen, this means that, for example, the ruling party, which is NRM, gets the lion's share. Yeah? And then other parties, for example, like FDC and UPC, receive something in modest. Yeah? And then if you talk about other emerging parties like END or even PPF, these often get nothing because at this point they have nothing. Yeah? And then, so the parties that never receive a single coin from the state survive because of masterclass in terms of improvisation. Yeah? So they campaign on hope in terms of the fuel on loyalty, and also the run on empty promises, as it were. So that becomes a super important aspect for us to also contextualize, even as we make this discourse as far as nomination fees is concerned. This, my friend, is a serious question for our country. Yeah. Let's talk about the aspect of donor dry spells. Yeah. The funding apocalypse, for example. Yeah. Let's not sugarcoat it. Donor fatigue has actually set in. The once generous external funders have actually scaled back, citing governance issues or democratic backsliding, for example, and even audit concerns. So there is no money coming in anymore. Yeah, the taps have actually dried up. Now, parties must learn to fetch from within. They must learn to improvise, to adapt, to overcome. These are questions that you have to think about, even when you make a dispensation as far as this issue is concerned. Now, let's make a dispensation in terms of with this so-called foreign funding reduction. Yeah, the result is there are fewer rallies. Yeah, the result is there's the aspect of collapsing district offices, for example. The result is there's aspect of ghosted campaign materials, for example. The result is the aspect of dominant use or even women leagues, for example. These are disturbing questions when it comes to resource mobilization as far as parties are concerned. Yes? So we have to understand that this is a serious question for our country today. Yes? Now, let's also make an analysis as far as survival instincts are concerned. The question is, what are the options? Do we have viable options? In a season of financial drought, for example, parties have to innovate. Or if they don't, they'll die. Some have viable strategies, for example. We could argue that those who have the strategies, for example, a so-called crowd-based micro-donation, for example. No has, for example, done this very well, effectively using digital tools and even youth engagement. Talk about mechanizing sales, for example, branding T-shirts, or even wheelbands, even in terms of party cards, for example, even political, commercing, as it were. Politics has to meet the commerce in this particular question. Yes? And then talk about membership subscription in terms of models, in terms of annual dues, or in terms of renewed pledges, for example. Those are viable options also. Talk about contributions from members of parliament, for example. Those who are already in parliament can actually bankroll these so-called party activities. They often come up with donations, for example, or even certain rations that have to be given to their parties for the better good, as it were. Yes, funding is not just free ride. Parties don't always control the who or even the why in terms of these so-called behind donations. This leads to funding capture, where big donors, for example, influence party decisions and candidate selection and even policy directions, as it were. Yes? Now, let's also make a discussion in as far as the real cost of participation, the argument of democracy or even elitism, as it were. Let's ask the hard questions when it comes to this particular dispensation. Yes? Are nomination fees building parties or are they killing democracy? That is a super hard question that we need to contextualize on. So we cannot hide away from this super question. Why? Because when the average Uganda earns, for example, less than 20,000 shillings a day and parties charge an average about 3 million to contest for MP, you have virtually excluded 90% of the population from even dreaming. This becomes a serious question, my friend. This means, my friends, that the poor at the end of the day must compete to become leaders, but they are virtually locked out because of financial constraints. This also means that wealth becomes a substitute for wisdom. This actually means that the parties become clubs for the rich. Not so. So these are serious issues, my friends. Yeah. So this therefore makes a serious affirmation that this ceases to be a democratic institution. This is now a monetized elitism of sorts. So we have to think about these begging questions. Yes. So the argument here is the political finance must be purposeful and not punitive. Yes, Uganda stands at the crossroad. The question is not whether parties should actually raise more money. They must, yes, but the question is how and from whom and for what. That is a serious issue for our country. Nomination fees should not be a ransom for leadership. They should be a contribution towards the people's cause. Every coin must speak, not just in balance sheets, but in the viable transformation that it ought to achieve. So in the end, a political party must answer substantively these three questions. Number one, who are we empowering? That becomes super important. Number two, what are we building? what are we building? Did you ever ask you that question? What are we building? And then number 3, at what cost? That becomes super important because we have to understand the country we're living in. Our GDP is thriving or at the mercy of external donors. So, because when politics becomes expensive, it's only the corrupt that can actually afford to lead. Do we understand that? We need to understand that becomes a super important question. Politics becomes expensive, then the corrupt can only afford to lead. So let the people find what they believe in. Let the parties account, and let Uganda breathe. This is a new political economy that we must build. One where trust, transparency, and transformation is very, very important. We cannot hide away from that. So when you're making this dispensation, you must understand the seriousness of the issues as far as this question is concerned. I would like to make that as my argument. And thank you once again for your attention.